Imagine walking into the most recognizable office in the world. You have a desk that has been used by presidents, a residence that is effectively a national landmark. A motorcade moves through traffic for you. Air Force One is available for official travel. Every major decision you make can affect markets, industries, government budgets, and the lives of millions of people. From the outside, being President of the United States looks like the ultimate financial position. And then you look at the paycheck. The president receives a salary of $400,000 a year, plus a $50,000 official expense allowance. The $400,000 figure has been in place since 2001. That is a very large salary by ordinary standards. But compared with the scale of the American economy, the cost of reaching the presidency, and the commercial opportunities associated with the office, it creates a strange economic picture. The presidency is not simply a job that pays $400,000 a year. It is closer to an extraordinarily expensive career investment, where the largest potential financial return may arrive only after the job is over. To understand why, start with the cost of getting there. A presidential campaign is not one expense. It is an economic machine that can operate for years before Election Day. Candidates need organizations, employees, consultants, pollsters, lawyers, advertising, travel, fundraising operations, digital infrastructure, events, security, and increasingly sophisticated data systems. And before a candidate ever reaches the general election, there may be months of competition in primaries and caucuses. The scale has changed dramatically over time. For the 2000 election cycle, presidential candidates who met the Federal Election Commission's reporting threshold collectively reported about $578.9 million in receipts and $1.21 billion in disbursements. By 2012, those figures were about $1.38 billion and $1.36 billion. In 2016, presidential candidates collectively raised about $1.54 billion and spent about $1.53 billion. Then came another jump. During the 2019-2020 cycle, presidential candidates collectively reported approximately $4.07 billion in receipts and $4.07 billion in disbursements. Political action committees reported roughly $13.2 billion in receipts and $12.9 billion in spending during the same two-year period. Those totals do not mean a single candidate personally pays billions of dollars. They represent the enormous financial ecosystem surrounding presidential elections. But they illustrate the environment in which a serious presidential campaign now operates. And the money is not distributed evenly. One candidate might build a huge, small-dollar fundraising operation. Another might depend more heavily on wealthy donors or candidate financing. Outside groups can spend independently to support or oppose candidates. Party organizations add another layer. The campaign itself has its own legal and reporting structure. The important economic point is that the presidency has become a market with extraordinarily high entry costs. And money is only one part of the investment. There is also time. A serious presidential campaign can consume a candidate's life for roughly 2 years or more. The calendar begins with exploratory activity, fundraising, endorsements, travel, debates, primary contests, and media appearances. Then comes the general election, followed by a transition period for the winner. For the candidate who loses, the return on that investment is immediate and uncertain. There is no presidential salary waiting at the end. That makes presidential politics unusual when viewed through the lens of personal finance. Imagine spending years building a company, putting enormous amounts of time into it, and knowing that on one particular Tuesday in November, the entire project could effectively fail. The campaign's expenses may have been legitimate campaign expenses, but from the individual's perspective, the opportunity cost is still enormous. During those years, the candidate could have been earning money as a lawyer, executive, physician, investor, author, professor, entrepreneur, or public speaker. Instead, the candidate is pursuing an office that pays $400,000 a year only if the campaign succeeds, and even winning does not immediately produce a spectacular financial return. In fact, the salary can look surprisingly modest when placed next to the scale of the job. Once in office, the president receives the statutory $400,000 annual salary and a $50,000 expense allowance. The president also receives official support that would normally represent major personal expenses: the White House residence, official transportation, staff, security, and government-funded travel for official duties. The legal framework also provides the president with use of furnishings and other effects belonging to the United States in the executive residence. This distinction matters. A president is not simply handed a giant personal spending account. Much of what looks like a financial benefit is actually institutional infrastructure required to perform the job. If the president travels on official business, the government provides the transportation and associated support. If the president lives in the White House, there is no ordinary rent payment comparable to renting a private mansion. If the president requires a large staff, those employees are part of the federal government rather than personal household employees paid from the president's salary. So the economic package is larger than the paycheck, but it is also different from simply earning millions in disposable income. The $400,000 salary itself is deliberately set by law. Congress establishes the Presidential Compensation Framework. The Constitution also contains an important restriction. During the term for which a president was elected, the compensation cannot be increased or decreased. The current statutory salary was established at $400,000, beginning in 2001, and has remained there. That creates an interesting historical problem. Inflation has changed the purchasing power of that salary, while the responsibilities of the presidency have obviously not become smaller. But the most important financial feature of the presidency may not be the salary at all. It is what happens afterward. When a president leaves office, the economic value of the presidency can change dramatically. Under the Former Presidents Act, a former president is entitled to a lifetime monetary allowance tied to the annual rate of basic pay for the head of an executive department, subject to the law's conditions. The government also provides an office staff, and the broader former president system includes support for office space, travel, and other expenses associated with life after the White House. In other words, the financial relationship between the government and a former president does not simply end on Inauguration Day. But even those benefits are only one part of the post-presidential economy. The larger phenomenon is the value of the presidential brand. A person who has served as President of the United States possesses something that cannot be easily reproduced, a credential that instantly communicates access to history, government, leadership, international affairs, crisis management, and an enormous global audience. That credential can be sold through legitimate commercial activities. Books are one obvious example. Bill Clinton's memoir, My Life, reportedly generated a $15 million advance. George W. Bush's Decision Points was reported at roughly $7 million. These are not the same contracts, and publishing arrangements vary, but together they demonstrate how presidential experience can become commercially valuable as intellectual property. Speaking is another. In 2001, shortly after leaving office, Bill Clinton delivered roughly 60 paid speeches and earned about $9.2 million in speaking fees that year. Contemporary reporting said individual fees ranged from about $75,000 to $350,000, depending on the engagement. That gives us a useful benchmark. 1 year of post-presidential speaking income could exceed what a president earns in the White House over many years. And this phenomenon is not confined to one political party. George W. Bush, a Republican, was reported to command a speaking rate reaching roughly $175,000 around the beginning of his post-presidential speaking career. Later reporting put his typical rate around $200,000, with variations depending on the event. Barack Obama, a Democrat, was publicly reported in 2017 to have agreed to a $400,000 speaking fee for a healthcare conference organized by Cantor Fitzgerald. Reports at the time also described another $400,000 appearance at an A&E Networks event. The exact market price of any former president's speech can vary enormously by venue, audience, geography, timing, and contract. But the economic mechanism is consistent. The market is not really paying several $100,000 for 60 minutes of talking. It is paying for access to a rare biography. A former president has lived through events that executives, investors, universities, foundations, media organizations, and international institutions want to discuss. The audience is not buying information that can be downloaded from a database. It is buying the opportunity to hear someone who personally occupied the most powerful elected office in the country. That creates scarcity. There have only been a limited number of former presidents in modern American history. That supply constraint matters. In economics, a scarce credential can command a premium when there is strong demand for the person who holds it. And the presidency creates several forms of intellectual property at the same time. There is the memoir. There is the speech. There is the interview. There are documentaries. There can be television or streaming projects. There can be advisory roles, nonprofit leadership, university relationships, foundation activities, and presidential libraries. The Obama example illustrates how the commercial ecosystem can extend beyond traditional speeches and books. In 2017, Barack and Michelle Obama were reported to have reached a joint book agreement worth more than $65 million, while later reporting documented the former president's continuing presence in the paid speaking market. George W. Bush provides a different but comparable example. His memoir, Decision Points, was commercially successful, while his speaking career generated substantial reported income. A congressional report reviewing former presidential benefits noted reports that Bush had earned about $15 million from more than 140 paid speeches between 2009 and 2015, alongside a major book contract, and Clinton's post-presidential speaking income followed the same basic mechanism, with congressional financial disclosures showing millions of dollars in speaking fees during his first year outside the White House, and subsequent reporting placing his cumulative speaking income over many years in the very high tens of millions. The key point is not which former president earned the most. It is that the presidency changes the economics of the person's name. Before the presidency, a politician might sell a book because readers are interested in politics. After the presidency, the same person's book can become a historical document. Before the presidency, a speaker might be paid for expertise. After the presidency, the speaker can be paid for first-hand experience of presidential decision-making. The credential itself becomes an asset. But that was not always true in the same way. For a long period of American history, leaving the presidency could actually create a financial problem. Consider Harry Truman. When Truman left office in 1953, there was no modern federal pension system for former presidents. The United States had already produced presidents who experienced very different financial outcomes after leaving office. Andrew Jackson and Herbert Hoover, for example, were financially comfortable. Others were not. Ulysses S. Grant experienced severe financial difficulties, and Harry Truman also struggled after returning to private life. Before 1958, former presidents received no federal pension or comparable federal financial assistance. Truman's situation is particularly useful because it exposes a weakness in the economics of the old system. The presidency created an enormous public obligation, but the government did not automatically provide the infrastructure required to support the former president afterward. Truman had a large volume of correspondence and requests for speeches and appearances. He had staff needs. He had the normal expenses of life after public office, but there was no established federal system paying for a former president's office and staff. According to Congressional Research Service material, Truman's financial difficulties were significant enough that in 1957, he wrote to House Speaker Sam Rayburn, warning that without legislative assistance, he would have to take additional contracts to keep financially afloat. His post-presidential income had largely come from the sale of family property and publication of his memoirs. That episode helped create political momentum for a structural solution. In 1958, Congress enacted the Former President's Act. The law established a pension and provided for office staff and other support. The purpose was not simply to make former presidents wealthy. The congressional rationale included maintaining the dignity of the office and recognizing that former presidents continued to receive correspondence, requests, and public obligations after leaving office. The change was historically important because it transformed the economics of retirement from the presidency. Before 1958, the former president's financial situation depended heavily on personal wealth, family assets, private work, and whatever commercial opportunities happened to be available. After 1958, there was a baseline public support system, and that baseline continued to evolve as the private market around former presidents became much larger. This produces the central economic paradox. The government pays the president relatively modest compensation compared with the scale of the office, but the office can create a highly valuable private credential. The value is realized later. Think of it as a two-stage investment. Stage one is the campaign. The candidate invests time, money, reputation, professional opportunity, and enormous amounts of energy. The probability of winning is uncertain, and most candidates receive no presidential salary at the end. Stage two begins only if the candidate wins. Now the person receives the statutory salary and the institutional benefits of office. But the potentially much larger economic return can arrive after the term. The former president may write a memoir. The former president may give speeches. The former president may participate in documentaries. The former president may establish a foundation or presidential center. The former president may participate in educational programs. The former president may enter advisory or board relationships where legally appropriate. And the former president now possesses an extremely rare credential that can be monetized by the private market. In investment terminology, the presidency can therefore be viewed as an asset with a delayed payoff. But there is an important distinction between the economics of the individual and the economics of the campaign. A presidential campaign can spend hundreds of millions of dollars without that money becoming personal income for the candidate. Campaign money is governed by campaign finance law. It is raised and spent for electoral purposes, not as a personal investment account. So, when we say that the presidency is an expensive investment, we are describing the personal opportunity cost and the broader campaign ecosystem, not suggesting that a candidate simply spends campaign donations and later receives them back personally. The financial payoff is instead connected to the credential created by winning and serving. And that credential has very different value depending on what happens afterward. In the best financial scenario, the former president converts the historical significance of the office into books, speeches, media projects, institutions, and other lawful opportunities over many years. In a weaker scenario, the former president may have limited commercial opportunities, limited publishing success, or a personal financial situation that makes the transition difficult. Harry Truman illustrates the second problem in the era before the modern support system existed. Clinton, Bush, and Obama illustrate the modern market in which the former presidential credential can support very large commercial opportunities. The political affiliations differ, but the economic mechanism is remarkably similar. Public office creates scarcity. Scarcity creates attention. Attention creates demand. And demand can be converted into income. That is the real economics of being President of the United States. The headline salary is $400,000. The cost of entry can involve years of campaigning and an enormous political finance ecosystem. The benefits while serving are substantial, but are largely institutional rather than personal cash income. And the most commercially valuable asset may not appear until the day the president leaves the White House. The presidency, viewed purely as a financial transaction, is therefore difficult to evaluate like an ordinary job. It resembles a high-risk investment in human capital. The candidate spends years acquiring a credential that very few people can ever obtain. If the campaign fails, the investment may produce no presidential salary at all. If the campaign succeeds, the person receives the salary, the institutional support, and something much more difficult to measure, a permanent place in American history. And that historical credential can later have measurable market value. There is a final irony here. The office itself is temporary. The economic asset it creates can last for decades. A presidential term lasts 4 years, potentially 8. A book can sell for decades. A speech career can last for years. A presidential library can operate for generations. A documentary can be watched long after the administration has disappeared from daily politics. And the name of a former president remains attached to the historical record indefinitely. So if you only look at the paycheck, the presidency appears to be a $400,000 a year job. If you look at the entire economic system, it is something very different. It is an extraordinary combination of high entry costs, uncertain returns, institutional compensation, public benefits, and a potentially enormous delayed value attached to one incredibly scarce credential. The presidency does not necessarily make its occupant rich while they are president. It can make their biography extraordinarily valuable afterward. And that may be the most unusual economic feature of the most powerful elected office in the United States. The job ends, but the market for what the job made, you can continue long after you leave the building.